You can't even afford a decent pair of shoes. What makes you think this entire village should trust your research? You may laugh at me.
She's wasting her life carrying bags of dirt.
Every handful of soil tells a story. And why? This isn't ordinary soil. Something has been hiding beneath the surface.
If your findings are correct, you may have just saved an entire village.
No one in that crowded hall could have imagined that only a few weeks later, the very discovery they had mocked would save the entire village from a devastating agricultural disaster, forcing everyone who had laughed at the poor female researcher to lower their heads in silent damsel. Morning in Kisii County always began with a thin layer of mist resting over the lush green hills. As the first rays of sunlight touched the modern houses with their blue and red metal roofs scattered among carefully maintained coffee gardens, Nyambura Akinyi put on a cream-colored reflective jacket over her striking green Ankara dress. A worn backpack hung from her shoulder. Inside were clean test tubes, a handheld magnifying glass, a waterproof notebook, and several specialized paper bags for storing soil samples. After the meeting filled with mocking laughter at the community hall, it seemed the entire village had found a new story to discuss. Happy. People were not talking about the troubling signs appearing across the farmland. They were not mentioning the coffee plants that had begun growing more slowly than usual. What interested them most was the image of a poor female researcher still carrying her box of soil samples, as though it were the most valuable treasure in the world. Nyambura walked slowly along the paved road leading toward the residential area. On both sides stood sturdy modern houses with white-painted iron fences, colorful flower beds, and solar panels shining beneath the morning sun. From time to time, a pickup truck carrying fertilizer or agricultural produce drove past, leaving a faint trail of dust behind it. A group of women standing outside a grocery store noticed her. They lowered their voices, but not enough to prevent her from hearing them. There she goes again with more bags of soil. She spent all those years studying, only to end up digging in the dirt. What is the point of having a degree if you are still poor? Quiet laughter followed. Nyambura continued walking. She did not turn around or show any anger. Those remarks were no longer unfamiliar to her. What hurt her was not the mockery directed at her, but the fact that so many people had become accustomed to believing that a person's value was determined by the car they drove or the house they owned. When she reached the small house she shared with her mother, she found Mama Beatrice Akinyi carefully arranging bundles of kale, tomatoes, and spring onions on a handcart before taking them to the market. Seeing her daughter return, Beatrice offered her a gentle smile. "Are you collecting samples again today?" Nyambura placed the box on the table. "Yes, mother. I want to examine a few more plots of land north of the village." Beatrice looked down at her daughter's worn shoes before asking softly, "Said unkind things again, didn't they?" Nyambura paused for a few seconds. It was nothing different from the other times. Beatrice stepped closer and brushed a speck of dust from her daughter's shoulder. "You do not have to prove that you are right to everyone." Nyambura smiled. "I only have to prove the truth." Beatrice nodded. "And I believe you will." Those few words always gave Nyambura a special kind of strength. The entire village could doubt her, but her mother had never once asked whether the years she had devoted to quiet research were truly worthwhile. After a simple breakfast of bread and ginger tea, Nyambura checked every instrument before leaving the house. She opened the thick notebook already filled with her handwriting. Every page contained detailed observations about soil moisture, color, root development, the smell of the upper soil layer, and even tiny changes in coffee leaves that an ordinary person might never notice. This was not the work of a few days or months. It was the result of years of persistence. Her first destination was a coffee farm near the stream that flowed through the village. The farm belonged to Ezekiel Mosetti, a man in his 50s who did not place much faith in scientific research. Still, he never stopped his Nyambura from collecting samples because she was always respectful. When he saw her approaching, he rested his hands on the handle of his hoe. "Here to inspect the soil again?" "Yes." "I only need to collect a few samples, just like last time." He sighed. It would be wonderful if those handfuls of soil could truly make the plants healthier. Nyambura crouched beside a coffee plant and examined the soil surrounding its base. Using a small stainless steel spoon, she collected soil from several carefully measured depths and placed each sample into a numbered paper bag. As her eyes moved across the young roots, she suddenly stopped. Something was different. The soil color looked normal. The moisture level had not changed significantly. But a thin layer of white threads was clinging to the smallest roots. She immediately took out her magnifying glass and studied them more closely. It did not look like an ordinary fungus. At least she had never seen that pattern of growth in the area before. Nyambura quickly recorded every detail in her notebook. Ezekiel watched her curiously. "Did you find something?" "It may only be a very small sign. Is it serious?" Nyambura remained silent for a few seconds before answering. "I cannot draw any conclusions yet." She understood that a researcher must never present a theory as fact without sufficient evidence. Her caution often made others believe she lacked confidence, but to Nyambura, there was no place for haste in science. After leaving Ezekiel's farm, Nyambura visited 3 other plots in the region. Each place gave her additional information. Several signs that had initially appeared unrelated began repeating across the pages of her notebook. Later that day, she returned to the small room that had been converted into her research space and placed all the soil samples on a wooden table. The room was less than 10 square meters, but everything inside had been carefully organized. The shelves held books on plant biology, soil microorganisms, and sustainable agriculture. In one corner stood an old microscope that she had purchased cheaply from a school after saving money for several months. She opened each soil sample, comparing its color, smell, and texture. Every difference, no matter how small, was recorded. Outside the window, the sounds of people talking and vehicles passing created the familiar rhythm of life in the modern village. Inside the small room, Nyambura was completely absorbed in her own world. She did not know that elsewhere in the village, Ruth Kamuntu was preparing to launch a new fertilizer business project that would soon affect nearly every farm in the region. No one knew that the notes scattered across Nyambura's old wooden table would gradually form a complete picture of what was changing beneath the village soil. At that moment, Nyambura believed only one thing. Every soil sample was telling a story, and she would not stop until she had heard the entire story. The hall at the Kisi County Agricultural Development Center was nearly full. Outside in the parking area, SUVs, pickup trucks, and small transport vehicles formed long rows. Inside, a large LED screens displayed images of lush green coffee hills alongside slogans about modern and sustainable agriculture. Farmers, plantation owners, agricultural buyers, and cooperative representatives had all arrived dressed in colorful Ankara and Kitenge outfits mixed with modern suits. Nyambura Akinyi entered the hall with her familiar backpack over one shoulder. She wore a simple but neat turquoise Ankara dress under a cream-colored jacket. In her hand was the notebook that had followed her throughout years of research. She chose a seat in the last row, quietly opened the notebook, and prepared to record any information that might be connected to the changing condition of the soil. A few minutes later, Ruth Kamuntu appeared to loud applause. The 35-year-old woman walked onto the stage in a striking red Kitenji dress, polished high heels, and a confident smile. Behind her stood several employees wearing uniforms bearing the logo of the agricultural supply company she managed. Ruth raised the microphones and spoke in a firm voice. "Today, I am pleased to introduce the largest farmer support program our company has ever launched. This new biological fertilizer will increase coffee yields, lower maintenance costs, and bring greater profits to every family." Applause filled the hall. Several plantation owners exchanged hopeful looks. After a number of disappointing harvests, everyone wanted a solution that could improve production. Ruth continued her presentation with attractive visuals and impressive growth charts. The figures on the screen caused many people to nod with satisfaction. Nyambura studied every listed ingredient carefully. She lowered her eyes to take notes, then suddenly stopped when a chart describing the recommended application process appeared. Her gaze remained fixed on it. Several details did not match what she had observed in the fields. She quickly opened her older notebook and compared the information with her records on soil moisture, microbial density, and the thin white thread she had recently discovered around coffee roots. The more she read, the deeper her frown became. After the presentation, the host invited questions from the audience. Some farmers asked about the cost. Others asked how the fertilizer should be stored. The atmosphere became lively. Nyambura took a deep breath and stood. The entire hall immediately turned toward her. Ruth recognized her and gave a faint, knowing smile. "Do you have a question?" Nyambura kept her voice calm. "I would like to know whether your company studied the soil microbiome in Kisii County before recommending that this fertilizer be used across the entire region." The hall fell silent for several seconds. Ruth smiled. "Of course. We conducted extensive research." Nyambura continued. "Over the past few months, I have found unusual signs around the root zones of several coffee farms. If an identified fungus or microorganism is already present in the soil, adding nutrients according to this formula may help it spread more rapidly." Whispers began moving through the room. Ruth folded her arms. "Do you have proof?" Nyambura answered honestly. "I am still gathering data, so I cannot offer a final conclusion yet." Laughter immediately rose from several seats. One man shook his head. "She has no conclusion, but she is already trying to frighten everyone." Another called out loudly, "What kind of research is built entirely on the word maybe?" Ruth looked across the hall, then turned back to Nyambura. "Miss Akinyi, science requires clear evidence, not feelings." Nyambura replied evenly. "That is exactly why I am asking for more testing before this product is applied on a large scale." Ruth laughed lightly. "And I believe in results that have already been verified." The audience applauded again. Ruth stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "I believe everyone here wants progress. No one wants to wait several more years because of a few unfinished theories." Several people nodded in agreement. Nyambura knew that continuing the argument would only increase the tension. She gave a small nod. "I only ask that everyone monitor the condition of the crops carefully after using the fertilizer. If anything unusual appears, please record it." Ruth answered immediately. "And if production increases as expected, I hope you will record that too." The atmosphere in the room softened, but the eyes directed toward Nyambura were still filled with doubt. When the presentation ended, many farmers hurried forward to register for the support program. Ruth's employees became busy handing out documents and explaining how the fertilizer should be used. Nyambura quietly gathered her notebook and walked outside. Just then, Chief Daniel Onjeri called after her. "Nyambura?" She turned. "Yes, Chief." He looked at her thoughtfully. "I know you take your research seriously." Nyambura waited for him to continue. "But you understand that the people need hope." She nodded. "I understand. If you do not yet have enough evidence, it will be difficult to persuade anyone to change their decision." Nyambura gave a faint smile. "That is why I will keep looking for evidence." Chief Daniel watched her for a few seconds. "I hope you are right." Then he added, "Or perhaps I hope you are wrong." Nyambura understood what he meant. If she was wrong, the harvest would remain safe. But if she was right, the whole of Kisii County could be facing something far more dangerous than anyone imagined. After leaving the center, she did not return home. Instead, she went directly to the nearest coffee farm that had registered for the new fertilizer program. She stood quietly before the rows of green plants swaying in the wind. The scene looked peaceful, so peaceful that no one could imagine a hidden thread beginning to spread beneath the fertile soil. Nyambura opened her notebook and wrote one short line: "Never allow optimism to replace verification." She closed the book, but her eyes remained fixed on the coffee plants standing silently in the sunlight. Only one goal remained in her mind. She had to find the answer before it was too late. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the small glass window of the research room behind the Kisii County Agricultural Science Center. The room was modest in size, neatly organized with metal bookshelves, a few sample cabinets, and an aging microscope. The steady hum of the ventilation fan blended with the soft rhythm of a moisture analyzer, creating a silence so complete that every page turned in a notebook could be heard. Nyambura Akinyi carefully placed the soil samples she had collected that day onto the work table. Every sample bag had been meticulously labeled with its collection site, the condition of the coffee plant, and her initial observations. She had always believed that in scientific research, One overlooked detail today could become tomorrow's answer to an enormous problem. P. She put on her gloves, transferred a tiny amount of soil onto a microscope slide, and positioned it beneath the lens. What appeared made her hold her breath. P. The thin white threads she had previously noticed in the fields were no longer isolated. They were now interconnected, forming delicate networks that clung to organic soil particles. Nyambura adjusted the magnification. P. She continued observing. In one corner of the slide, the structures appeared to wrap themselves around the youngest roots of the test plant. P. She immediately reached for a reference book on soil-borne fungi and began comparing the images one by one. No match. She pulled another reference from the shelf. Still no exact match. P. Her heartbeat quickened. If this was not a common fungus, then Kisii County might be facing a previously unrecorded soil microorganism. Nyambura took a slow, deep breath to steady herself. P. A researcher could never rush to conclusions. She examined 3 more soil samples collected from different farms. The results were nearly identical. P. The white filaments appeared at different densities, yet they all shared one striking characteristic. They surrounded the healthiest young roots. That completely contradicted everything she had learned. P. If her theory was correct, this microorganism did not attack the plant immediately. Instead, it quietly developed beneath the surface before causing visible damage. That was what frightened her most. P. Nyambura picked up a red pen and circled several notes in her notebook. Every location where she had collected samples shared one important similarity. P. They were also the same farms preparing to adopt Ruth Kemunto's new fertilizer program. She sat quietly for a long time. P. Her mind drifted back to the meeting that morning and the laughter that had echoed through the hall. If she warned everyone again without stronger evidence, people would only accuse her of trying to sabotage a project that promised better profits. P. But if she remained silent, what if her theory was right? Nyambura stood and walked toward the whiteboard hanging on the wall. She began writing the next steps. P. Collect more samples, measure the growth rate, compare moisture levels, evaluate root damage, prepare a preliminary report. Not a single step could be skipped. P. Those were the principles she had followed since becoming a researcher. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Samuel Otieno stepped inside. Seeing the light still on, he smiled. P. I thought I might find you here. Nyambura stood respectfully. I wanted to examine a few more samples. He walked toward the table, studying the neatly arranged trays. P. Have you discovered anything new? Nyambura hesitated for a moment. I found a repeating pattern, but I still don't have enough evidence to call it a conclusion. P. Samuel nodded with quiet approval. Good. Nyambura looked at him in surprise. He continued. The reason I trust a researcher is not because they always claim to be right. P. It's because they know when they don't yet have enough proof. His words brought a faint smile to her face. P. For years, very few people had understood why she refused to make premature conclusions. But Samuel understood. He glanced at the thick notebook filled with her handwriting. P. How long have you been recording these observations? More than 3 years. His eyebrows lifted slightly. More than 3 years, yes. You've never skipped a single day? P. Nyambura shook her head. Not whether it rained or the sun was shining. Samuel remained silent for a long moment. He did not praise her, nor did he show surprise. P. Instead, he simply said, don't let people's laughter make you forget why you started. With that, he quietly left the room. Nyambura watched him disappear down the hallway. His words strengthened her resolve. P. When evening settled over Kisii County, she returned home. The lights in the living room were already on. Mama Beatrice sat carefully counting the money she had earned selling vegetables at the market. P. The moment she saw her daughter, she poured her a cup of warm water. You worked late again today. Nyambura sat beside her. There were a few things I needed to examine. P. Beatrice studied her thoughtful expression. Is something wrong? Nyambura did not want her mother to worry. I think I may be getting closer, but I could still be wrong. P. Beatrice smiled gently. Do you know what gives me the greatest peace? Nyambura shook her head. Whether you're right or wrong, you've always been honest with what you've seen. P. Those simple words made Nyambura's eyes sting. She realized that throughout the years, what had kept her moving forward was never the dream of fame or wealth. P. It was the quiet faith of the woman who had always stood behind her. After their simple dinner, Nyambura returned to the small workspace in her home. She switched on her computer and entered all the new data into her research files. As the graphs appeared on the screen, she suddenly stopped typing. The patterns from different locations were beginning to converge. Every trend pointed in the same direction. Something unusual was spreading beneath the soil. She still did not know exactly what it was. But she knew one thing with certainty. Time was running out. Nyambura closed her research notebook. Outside the window, the night sky above Kisii County shimmered with countless stars. In that peaceful darkness, no one realized that a scientific discovery capable of changing the future of an entire village was slowly taking shape on the small desk of the woman so many people had dismissed as the girl who only digs in the dirt. The atmosphere at the Central Agricultural Market in Kisii County was no longer as lively as usual. Coffee stalls that were normally crowded with buyers now displayed worried faces instead. Pickup trucks arriving from nearby farms were unloading freshly cut coffee branches, and instead of the healthy green leaves everyone expected to see, many of the younger branches were already beginning to turn yellow. Farmers gathered in small groups, exchanging anxious whispers about the strange symptoms that had suddenly appeared across several plantations. Nyambura Akinyi had barely entered the market when she heard someone calling urgently from a distance. Nyambura, could you come over here for a moment? It was Ezekiel Moseti, the plantation owner whose farm she had visited many times to collect soil samples. The calm expression he usually wore had disappeared. Even in the cool morning air, sweat covered his forehead beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Nyambura quickly followed him to the pickup truck parked beside the road. The truck bed was filled with dozens of coffee branches freshly cut from his plantation. The moment she saw them, her heart grew heavy. The leaves were not burned by the sun. They did not resemble drought damage. The tips of the branches remained green, yet the leaves in the middle had begun turning pale yellow before curling inward in an unusual pattern. Exactly what she had feared. Ezekiel looked at her anxiously. Is this caused by insects? Nyambura crouched down to examine the base of one branch before gently shaking her head. I can't say yet, he sighed deeply. 2 days ago, only a few trees looked like this. This morning, it spread across an entire section. His words immediately prompted Nyambura to open her notebook. She carefully recorded the location, the symptoms, and every visible detail. While she worked, more farmers arrived carrying branches showing the same condition. The moment she had dreaded had finally arrived. The phenomenon was no longer isolated. It was spreading. A middle-aged woman pushed through the crowd. My plantation has the same problem. Moments later, another farmer added, the eastern fields are starting to show it too. The conversations grew louder. Some blamed the weather, others suspected contaminated water. A few believed the coffee variety itself was the problem. But no one truly knew the answer. Just then, Ruth Kemunto arrived with several employees to meet farmers participating in her fertilizer program. Seeing the gathering crowd, she walked over. What's happening? Ezekiel lifted one of the coffee branches. Many farms are beginning to show these symptoms. Ruth examined it for only a few seconds before speaking confidently. This is simply the plants adjusting to a new nutritional program. There is no reason to worry. Several farmers immediately nodded. They wanted to believe a simple explanation rather than face the possibility of a much larger problem. Nyambura looked directly at Ruth. I think we should collect samples immediately. Ruth turned toward her. Are you bringing up your theory again? Nyambura answered calmly. I'm talking about verifying the evidence. Ruth smiled politely. Our company will continue monitoring the situation. But at this point, there is no reason to conclude that a serious problem exists. Nyambura remained composed. Precisely because we don't have a conclusion, we should investigate now. The two women looked at each other for several silent moments. The tension between them became unmistakable. Chief Daniel Onjeri arrived shortly after hearing the reports. He looked around the crowded market. How many farms have reported these symptoms? Hands slowly began rising throughout the crowd. There were far more than anyone had expected. The village chief spoke thoughtfully. I want every farming household to record the condition of their crops each day and report the information to the community office. Then he turned toward Nyambura. P. Would you be willing to help monitor the situation? She nodded immediately. Of course, Ruth offered no objection. She simply added, the more information we gather, the better. P. Hearing those words gave Nyambura a measure of relief. At least people were finally willing to collect evidence instead of ignoring the earliest warning signs. P. For the remainder of the morning, she barely stopped moving. She walked from one group of farmers to another, examining leaves, checking roots, collecting soil, carefully labeling every sample. Several people who had laughed at her only days before now approached her with anxious questions. Do you think my coffee trees can still be saved? Nyambura always gave the same answer. I don't know yet. Some looked disappointed, but she refused to offer hope she could not scientifically support. That was a line she would never cross. By the end of the morning, her backpack was overflowing with new soil samples. She stood alone beside the road, gazing across the rolling coffee hills. The wind still moved gently through the fields. From a distance, everything appeared green and healthy. Only those who walked close enough could see the first leaves quietly changing color. At that moment, Noah Barasa, the engineer responsible for the region's irrigation system, approached carrying a folder of water supply reports. I heard you're investigating the coffee disease. Nyambura nodded. And you? He unfolded a detailed map. I've inspected the entire irrigation network. Did you find anything unusual? He shook his head. The water supply is completely normal. Nyambura studied the map. If the water was not responsible, then one more possibility had been eliminated. Noah looked at the heavy backpack on her shoulders. I don't fully understand your research, but if you ever need technical support or topographical maps, just let me know. Nyambura smiled gratefully. Thank you. It was the first time in many days that someone had offered genuine help instead of suspicion. That afternoon, she returned to the research room and carefully placed every new soil sample on the work table. There were twice as many as usual. She looked quietly at each numbered bag. She felt no satisfaction in seeing her earlier concerns becoming reality, only sadness. Because every sample represented far more than scientific data. Each one carried the hopes of a family whose livelihood depended on the coffee fields outside. Nyambura closed her eyes for a brief moment before opening her notebook. She wrote a single sentence. When the truth begins to reveal itself, the most important task is not proving who was right, but finding a way to protect those who are suffering. She laid down her pen. Somewhere beyond the laboratory walls, the people of Kisii County were waiting for answers. And she knew she had to find them before those green hills became symbols of disappointment for an entire community. Sunlight streamed through the large glass windows of the Kisii County Agricultural Science Center. The hallways, usually quiet, had become unusually busy as laboratory technicians continuously carried soil samples, root specimens, and field reports into the analysis room. News of the mysterious disease spreading through the coffee plantations had reached villages across the county, creating an atmosphere of urgency throughout the research center. Nyambura Akinyi walked briskly into the laboratory, carrying a box filled with carefully labeled soil samples. Her face remained calm, but her eyes reflected intense concentration. For days, she had devoted nearly every waking hour to comparing soil samples, microscope images, and years of handwritten observations. As soon as she placed the sample box on the table, a laboratory assistant approached her. Dr. Samuel would like to see you. Nyambura looked surprised. Is something wrong? He's waiting in the meeting room. She took a slow breath, picked up her familiar notebook, and headed down the hallway. When she entered the room, she saw Dr. Samuel Otieno seated at a long conference table. Spread across the table were dozens of research files. What surprised her even more was that many of them were copies of the reports she had submitted over the past 3 years. Samuel looked up. Please have a seat. Nyambura nodded respectfully. He slowly opened one file after another. I spent the entire afternoon reviewing all of your research. She remained silent. I didn't just read your latest report. I started from the very beginning. He lifted an older file. 3 years ago, you documented unusual changes in the organic layer of the soil. Then he opened another. 2 years ago, you recorded the appearance of white filament networks surrounding young coffee roots. He reached for yet another report. 1 year ago, you warned that this phenomena appeared to be spreading in clusters. Each sentence left Nyambura more astonished. She had never imagined that anyone would patiently read reports that had long been categorized as needing further observation. Samuel finally closed the last folder. Every piece of data connects. Nyambura answered softly. I always believed one day they would form a complete picture. Samuel nodded, and today, I believe they have. He stood and walked toward the digital display mounted on the wall. A detailed map of Kisii County appeared on the screen. Samuel highlighted every plantation where coffee trees had begun showing signs of decline. Then he activated another layer. It displayed every location where Nyambura had collected soil samples over the past 3 years. The two sets of data almost perfectly overlapped. Nyambura stared at the screen as her heart raced. Samuel pointed toward the map. What do you see? She answered without hesitation. The first farms showing symptoms are the same farms I began monitoring years ago. Exactly. Samuel turned toward her. That means your research isn't a collection of random observations. It's a connected body of scientific evidence. For the first time in years, someone recognized the value of her quiet dedication through the strength of her own data. Yet Nyambura did not smile. Instead, she quietly asked, is it still possible to stop this? Samuel understood exactly what she meant. If the disease continued spreading, every passing day could cost countless farmers another section of their harvest. He answered slowly. If we want to know whether there's still time, we must act immediately. Samuel opened a drawer and removed an official envelope. I've already received approval from the research center. Starting today, you will lead the field investigation team. Nyambura's eyes widened. Me? I need the person who understands these data better than anyone else. That person is you. She lowered her head for a moment. For years, she had been known only as the woman who walked around carrying bags of soil. For years, her notebooks had been dismissed as useless. Today, those same notebooks had become the foundation for a county-wide scientific investigation. Samuel continued, but there's something even more important. He handed her another document. Tonight we'll be meeting with representatives from the agricultural cooperatives. I want you to present the findings yourself. Nyambura immediately shook her head. They won't believe me. Samuel smiled gently. Perhaps not, but they'll believe the evidence. He placed his hand on her stack of reports. Don't let them see a poor young woman. Let them see the facts. Those words struck her deeply. They perfectly reflected the purpose she had pursued all these years. She had never wanted to win arguments. She had only wanted the truth to speak for itself. After leaving the meeting room, Nyambura returned to the laboratory. She spread every newly collected soil sample across the table. Beside them lay the worn notebooks that had accompanied her throughout years of fieldwork. She began organizing every chart, map, microscope image, and observation into chronological order. Looking back over her journey, she remembered the countless days when she had collected only a single soil sample. She remembered walking for hours beneath the hot African sun simply to record one tiny change in the roots of a coffee plant. At the time, many people had believed those efforts were meaningless, but science had never been built upon dramatic discoveries alone. It had always begun with small observations. Late that afternoon, Noah Barasa entered the laboratory carrying an updated topographical map. I thought you might need this. Nyambura unfolded the map. Groundwater channels, slopes, and natural drainage systems had all been carefully marked. She looked at Noah gratefully. Thank you, he smiled. No need. If you discover the cause, the entire county benefits. Nyambura nodded. For the first time in years, she no longer felt completely alone. When everything had finally been prepared, she stood quietly before the whiteboard reviewing the investigation plan. Outside, the afternoon sunlight slowly softened. Inside, the laboratory lights remained on. Nyambura gently closed her research notebook. She still carried enormous pressure because she understood something very important. Being trusted was not the finish line. It was only the beginning. Out beyond the laboratory walls, thousands of coffee trees were still waiting for answers, and this time she would carry far more than bags of soil into the fields. She would carry the hopes of an entire community that had finally begun placing its trust in science integrity and the quiet perseverance she had protected for so many years. At exactly 11:18 a.m., the agricultural testing site on the southern edge of Kisi County was more crowded than it had ever been. Rows of coffee plants, marked with different colored stakes, stretched beneath the bright African sun. Surrounding the fields were plantation owners, agricultural technicians, cooperative representatives, and villagers who had come to witness the field trial that Dr. Samuel Otieno had approved based on Nyambura Akinyi's research. The atmosphere was filled with both hope and tension. If the experiment failed, many families would lose the last hope they had left. If it succeeded, the entire county might finally find a way to save the coffee plantations that were slowly declining. Nyambura stood at the edge of the testing field, holding a folder of research notes. She wore her familiar turquoise Ankara dress beneath a cream-colored jacket, but there was something different about her today. Gone was the hesitation of a woman constantly doubted by others. In its place stood the quiet confidence of a researcher who fully understood the responsibility resting on her shoulders. Samuel walked over. "Is everything ready?" Nyambura nodded. "Yes." He looked across the experimental plots. "Today simply present what the evidence shows. You don't need to impress anyone." She smiled gently. "I understand." Once everyone had gathered, Samuel briefly explained the purpose of the field trial before inviting Nyambura to speak. For the first time in many years, she stood before a large audience not to defend herself, but to explain her scientific findings. She opened a large field map. "Over the past 3 years, I have collected data from farms throughout Kisi County." She pointed toward the display. "The plantations showing the earliest signs of decline have one thing in common. The problem is not the water supply. It is not the coffee variety. It lies within the changing microbial ecosystem surrounding the roots." Several people leaned forward with growing interest. There was no laughter this time. Nyambura continued. "The most dangerous part of this phenomenon is that it develops very slowly. At first, the plants appear completely healthy. Only after the roots have been affected for a long period do the leaves begin changing color." Ezekiel Moseti, standing among the crowd, slowly nodded. It matched exactly what he had observed on his own farm. Nyambura pointed toward the first testing section. "This area will remain completely unchanged." Then she turned toward another section. "In this area, we will apply the new treatment protocol. The solution did not involve replacing coffee varieties. It did not require increasing fertilizer, nor did it depend on powerful chemicals." Her approach was surprisingly simple. Adjust the balance of organic matter. Reduce soil moisture around the roots during critical growth stages. Introduce a naturally occurring local microorganism capable of competing with the unusual white fungal network she had discovered. Several people exchanged surprised glances. Many had expected an expensive or highly technical solution. Instead, Nyambura's answer relied on working with nature itself. Ruth Kemunto had also arrived. She stood quietly near the back of the crowd with her arms folded. The absolute confidence she had once displayed was no longer visible. The field trial began. Technicians carefully followed every step of the protocol exactly as Nyambura had designed it. Every observation was documented. Every measurement was recorded. Samuel reminded everyone repeatedly, "We are here to test evidence. We are not here to prove anyone right." His words caused the crowd to fall silent. Those words also reflected the scientific principles Nyambura had followed throughout her career. After the treatment had been completed, everyone walked toward the comparison plots. There, several untreated coffee plants showed increasingly visible signs of decline. Meanwhile, the plants receiving Nyambura's protocol remained stable. Although it was far too early to declare complete success, the initial differences were obvious enough to surprise many observers. An elderly farmer approached Nyambura. "Do you believe our plantations can still be saved?" She looked across the rows of coffee plants before answering quietly, "If we recognize the problem early enough, there is always hope." The old farmer nodded. "I'll follow your instructions." Soon afterward, more farmers gathered around her. No one asked why she was poor. No one mentioned her old shoes. They wanted only one thing: to learn how to protect their coffee trees. that touched Nyambura more deeply than any applause ever could. Not because people finally respected her, but because they had finally begun trusting evidence instead of prejudice. While technicians continued recording data, Noah Barasas arrived carrying an updated drainage map. He pointed toward one hillside. "I've just completed another inspection. The areas with the slowest natural drainage are also the places where the disease appeared first." Nyambura immediately compared his information with her own data. The final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Soil moisture, microbial balance, soil structure, terrain. There was no single cause. Several natural conditions had combined to create the perfect environment for the mysterious fungal network to spread. Samuel looked at both of them. "It seems we're moving in the right direction." Nyambura nodded. "But I still want more observation." Samuel smiled. "You're as careful as ever, and that's exactly why I trust your work." The field trial ended in complete silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of doubt, but the thoughtful silence of people beginning to understand. Conversations throughout the crowd had changed. Plantation owners were discussing how to share field observations. Farmers who had once mocked Nyambura were now asking for copies of her monitoring guidelines. Ruth remained standing quietly beside the demonstration plots. She slowly walked toward Nyambura. "I still want to see more results." Nyambura smiled warmly. "So do I. I don't expect people to believe me. I only hope they'll believe what we discover together." Ruth remained silent for several moments before giving a small nod. It was not yet an apology. But for the first time, she no longer dismissed Nyambura's work. As everyone gradually left the testing site, Nyambura remained standing among the rows of coffee plants. She knelt down and gently touched the soil surrounding one healthy root. For years, this ordinary soil had taught her one simple truth. The truth never needs to shout. It only needs enough time to be seen. And today, for the very first time, the people of Kisii County had finally begun listening. The square in front of the Kisii County Agricultural Cooperative Headquarters was filled with people. No formal invitations had been sent, and no special event had been advertised. News about the encouraging results from the field trials had spread quickly through the surrounding villages, and hundreds of farmers had gathered on their own to hear the latest report. The warm afternoon sunlight reflected off the colorful Ankara and Kitenge clothing worn by the crowd, creating an atmosphere that felt both festive and deeply meaningful. On the large LED screen, set up in the center of the square, the newest photographs from the experimental coffee fields appeared one after another. Nyambura Akinyi stood quietly behind the stage and took a slow, deep breath. She had never imagined this moment. In the past, every time she entered a public meeting, she was greeted with doubtful eyes. Today, she felt something completely different. People were waiting to hear her. Dr. Samuel Otieno walked over to her. "Don't be nervous," Nyambura smiled softly. "I'm not nervous. I just hope everyone understands. This is only the beginning." Samuel nodded with satisfaction. That was exactly what he wanted to hear. A true researcher never mistakes one encouraging result for the end of the journey. When the presentation officially began, Samuel briefly summarized the monitoring process before inviting Nyambura to speak. She stepped onto the stage. The square became completely silent. Nyambura opened her report. "During the observation period, the fields where we adjusted soil moisture and introduced beneficial native microorganisms showed clear improvement." Images immediately appeared on the giant screen. In the untreated areas, many coffee trees continued showing signs of decline. Meanwhile, the plots following Nyambura's protocol displayed healthier young roots, greener leaves, and a noticeable reduction in plant stress. A wave of whispers spread across the crowd. An elderly farmer suddenly stood. "I was the first person to follow her recommendations." He turned toward the audience. "I didn't believe her at first, but this morning's inspected every section of my farm." His voice trembled with emotion. "The trees that were in the worst condition are beginning to recover." Applause erupted throughout the square. Soon afterward, a young woman stepped forward. "The same thing happened on our farm. If we hadn't changed our methods when we did, we probably would have lost our entire harvest." The atmosphere changed completely. There were no more skeptical comments. Instead, genuine questions filled the air. How can we recognize the early signs? What should we monitor first? P. Can you teach our cooperative? Nyambura patiently answered every question. She never acted superior. She never reminded anyone of the insults she had endured. P. For her, the only thing that mattered now was helping as many people as possible learn how to protect their land. Standing near the back of the crowd, Ruth Kemunto remained silent. P. She watched the images on the screen. Then she looked at the farmers, listening carefully to Nyambura. For the first time in many years as a businesswoman, Ruth realized she had placed too much faith in profit projections while forgetting that nature must first be understood before it can ever be managed. She slowly walked on the stage. The crowd turned toward her. Ruth took the microphone but remained silent for several moments. Finally, she spoke. I've spent the past several days reviewing every piece of data. I also visited each of the experimental fields myself. She turned toward Nyambura. What I saw wasn't luck. It was the result of years of perseverance. The square fell completely silent. No one had expected Ruth to say those words. She continued. I always believed business experience could solve every problem. But today I understand. There are questions that only patience and honest research can answer. Then she faced Nyambura directly. Thank you. It was not a formal apology, but everyone understood its meaning. Nyambura simply smiled and thank you for choosing to work together for our farmers. Ruth looked surprised. She had expected criticism. Instead, Nyambura never mentioned the public humiliation or the cruel laughter from earlier meetings. That moment deeply moved many people watching. Chief Daniel Onjeri stepped forward. He looked across the crowd before speaking. Today we didn't only learn how to save our coffee fields. We learned something much greater. He paused briefly. Never judge a person's worth by their clothes, their car, or the amount of money they possess. If we had listened more carefully to Nyambura from the very beginning, many families could have been spared weeks of fear. Many people lowered their heads. They remembered laughing inside the community hall. Some had called her a dreamer. Others had claimed her education was useless. Now those very people were holding notebooks, carefully writing down every one of her recommendations. After the presentation, dozens of farmers came forward to shake Nyambura's hand. Ezekiel Mosetti smiled warmly. I used to think you only understood theory. Today I realize you were simply seeing farther ahead than the rest of us. Nyambura gently shook her head. No, I only started observing earlier. A young agricultural technician standing nearby asked, how did you keep going for 3 years when nobody believed in you? Nyambura looked toward the green coffee hills in the distance before answering quietly. My goal was never to make people believe in me. I only wanted the truth to be seen. Her answer left many people deep in thought. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Samuel walked over and stood beside her. He watched groups of farmers discussing scientific observations instead of rumors. Then he smiled. Do you see that? Nyambura followed his gaze. They're talking about science. Samuel nodded. That is the greatest success of all. Not the applause, not the speeches, but the fact that an entire community had begun changing the way it thought. The evening sun disappeared behind the rolling coffee hills. A gentle breeze crossed the square. Nyambura quietly closed the notebook that had accompanied her through years of silent determination. She knew the journey was far from over. But the most important change had already begun. The community's trust was no longer built upon prejudice. It was now built upon truth, perseverance, and the power of knowledge used to serve others. The square in front of the Kisii County Administration building was decorated with vibrant kitenge fabric banners and colorful native flowers. Shiwastas of villagers, hundreds of villagers, cooperative representatives, agricultural educators, business leaders, and farming families had gathered early that morning. The atmosphere was completely different from the meeting where mocking laughter had once filled the community hall. There were no banners celebrating a single individual. Instead, a simple message stood proudly above the stage: knowledge in service of the community. Nyambura Akinyi stood quietly behind the stage, adjusting the cream-colored jacket over her turquoise Ankara dress. She was still wearing the same worn shoes that had accompanied her through years of field research. One of the event organizers glanced at her shoes and spoke gently. Would you like to change into the new pair we prepared for you? Nyambusa smiled and shook her head. P. Thank you. These shoes have walked every field with me. I want them to stay with me until the end of today. The young organizer nodded respectfully. P. A few moments later, Chief Daniel Onjeri stepped onto the stage to warm applause. He looked across the crowded square before speaking in his steady voice. P. Today, we are not honoring someone because they defeated others. We are thanking someone who chose perseverance while many others chose doubt. The entire square fell silent. P. He continued, over the past months, thanks to the cooperation of researchers, engineers, farming cooperatives, and especially the years of careful observation recorded by Nyambura Akinyi, we were able to respond before it was too late. P. Our coffee plantations are beginning to recover. The applause lasted for a long time. When the chief finished speaking, Dr. Samuel Otieno stepped forward. P. Instead of presenting awards or statistics, he held up Nyambura's very first research notebook. Its corners were worn. Its pages showed years of careful use. Samuel raised it high. P. Do you know what the most valuable thing inside this notebook is? No one answered. He smiled gently. It isn't the numbers. It isn't the charts. P. It's the fact that someone refused to give up. Even when almost nobody was listening, the square became completely silent. Samuel turned toward Nyambura. P. Would you like to say a few words? She stepped onto the stage. She looked across the familiar faces. There was Ezekiel. There was Noah. P. There were farmers who had once laughed at her. There were others who had silently watched her journey. And sitting in the front row was her mother. P. Mama Beatrice wore a simple purple kitenge dress, her face glowing with quiet pride. Nyambura took the microphone. I've imagined these days many times. For a long time. P. I thought what I wanted most was recognition. She paused. But standing here today, I realized something much more valuable. P. I get to see these coffee fields alive again. Many people nodded. She continued. If you ask me who deserves the greatest gratitude, my answer will never be myself. P. She looked toward her mother. It is my mother. It is every farmer who allowed me to collect soil from their land. P. It is every colleague who insisted on verifying the evidence, and even those who doubted me. The audience looked surprised. Nyambura smiled. P. Because their doubts reminded me to be even more careful before reaching any conclusion. Applause echoed once again. At that moment, Ruth Kemunto stood from the front row. P. She slowly walked onto the stage. The confidence she had once displayed had been replaced by quiet humility. Today she wore a simple dark blue kitenge dress. She looked directly at Nyambura. P. I have something I want to say. The square became silent. I used to believe success meant always having the answers. Today I understand. P. Sometimes success begins by learning how to listen. She took a slow breath. I am sorry for allowing my assumptions to become more powerful than the truth. P. It was the first time Ruth had apologized publicly, not because anyone forced her, but because she had genuinely recognized the value of humility. Nyambura stepped forward. P. She refused to let Ruth stand alone on the stage. She gently extended her hand. I accept your apology, but what matters even more, P, is that from today onward, we work together for our farmers. Ruth nodded. I would like that. The audience rose to its feet in applause. P. Not because they were witnessing a dramatic reconciliation, but because they understood that a community can only move forward when people with different perspectives choose the same purpose. P. After the ceremony, many young people gathered around Nyambura. One young woman asked, I love science, but I'm afraid I'm not talented enough. Nyambura smiled warmly. No one begins with excellence. P. Everyone begins with curiosity. A young man asked another question. What is the hardest part of being a researcher? Nyambura answered without hesitation. It isn't the lack of money. P. It isn't the lack of equipment. The hardest part is continuing to do the right thing, even when no one can yet see its value. P. Many people quietly wrote down her words. Near the end of the ceremony, Chief Daniel announced the official launch of the Village Science Initiative in Kisii County. The program would provide free training for young people in agricultural science, soil observation, ecosystem protection, and field research. He looked toward Nyambura. I hope you'll become our very first instructor. P. Emotion filled her eyes as she nodded. It would be my honor. As the celebration gradually came to an end, people slowly returned home. Nyambura did not leave immediately. P. Instead, she walked alone toward the nearby coffee fields. The rows of trees had already begun turning green once again. A gentle breeze moved through the leaves. P. She bent down, picked up a handful of soil, and smiled. The first time she carried those soil samples into the community hall, people saw only a poor young woman. Today, P. They finally saw what she had always been trying to protect. Not the reputation of a scientist, but the future of an entire community willing to respect knowledge, seek the truth, and understand that a person's true worth is never measured by what they own, but by the good they patiently create for others. 1 year later, Kisii County welcomed a new harvest season filled with hope and celebration. The coffee hills that had once stood on the edge of disaster were now covered in healthy green leaves once again. The harvest gradually returned to normal, but the greatest transformation was not measured by production alone. It was reflected in the way the community had changed its mindset. Whenever unusual signs appeared in the fields, farmers no longer rushed to conclusions or followed rumors. Instead, they carefully recorded their observations, consulted agricultural specialists, and attended the free training sessions offered through the Village Science Initiative led by Nyambura Akinyi. Nyambura's small research room was no longer quiet and empty. Every week, young people from across the county came to learn how to observe soil, analyze samples, and understand science does not exist only inside modern laboratories. It begins with patience, curiosity, and honesty in every small detail. Mama Beatrice continued selling vegetables at the local market, just as she had done for many years. But whenever someone mentioned her daughter, she simply smiled with quiet pride. Nyambura never considered herself a hero. To her, the greatest reward was seeing her community united, respecting knowledge, and working together to build a stronger and more sustainable future. The part of this story that stayed with me the most was not that Nyambura finally earned everyone's respect. It was the way she chose to use her knowledge to serve her community, instead of proving she was better than those who doubted her. In life, it is easy to judge people by the clothes they wear, the jobs they have, or the money they possess. Yet a person's true worth is revealed through perseverance, integrity, and the positive impact they leave on the lives of others. Knowledge only becomes truly valuable when it is guided by responsibility, compassion, and a desire to make the world better. This story also reminds us that listening to different perspectives, respecting evidence, and refusing to let prejudice replace truth can protect an entire community from costly mistakes. If this story inspired you or gave you a new perspective, please leave a comment telling us which country or city you're watching from. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to share it with someone you care about and subscribe to the channel so we can continue spreading meaningful, inspiring stories that celebrate hope, dignity, and the power of kindness.